the simpler you make a system and the more you lean into the platform, the longer it will last. So if you want to have a website that will be usable and deployable in 100 years, then use the simplest stack possible.
Hi, and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. I'm Paige Niedringhaus, and today we have Carson Gross at Big Sky Software here to talk about HTMX in 2025. In this episode, Carson and I talk about the origin story of HTMX and its rise to social media fame, how to approach HTMX if you're a React developer, and why the stable libraries are oftentimes better than the latest and greatest new framework. So here is our episode with Carson Gross. Welcome to the show, Carson.
Thank you, Paige. I'm excited to be here and happy to talk about HTMX and anything else you want to talk about.
Absolutely. Well, let's start. This is all based on an article that you wrote recently. For those of you who have not been in the Twitterverse and seen a lot of the memes that HTMX drops regularly, can you tell us a little bit about the origin story of it and how it evolved from intercooler.js?
Yeah, sure. The HTMX is a sort of intercooler 2.0. So it's a next version of intercooler. And intercooler was a library that I had released way back in 2013. It was for building web front ends, but it was different than most of the web front end libraries at the time in that it really focused on using HTML to update the UI. So it would make exchanges, what I would call hypermedia exchanges, or less fancy, just it would get HTML back from the server instead of what was becoming increasingly the standard at that point, which was getting JSON back and then using a client-side template rendering system. And so intercooler had been out for a long time. And whenever COVID really got serious, I locked myself in a room and rewrote it. Intercooler was from the jQuery era. And so it depended on jQuery. And I always felt maybe JavaScript has gotten to a point where we don't have to have that dependency anymore. And so when COVID happened, I said, okay, I'm just going to try to see what I could do. And I did it and it worked pretty well. And I called it HTMX to give it a refresh as far as the name goes and launched that. I'd always been pretty silly on Twitter in general, but I really was like, you know what, I'm just going to lean into it because the only way to get any attention in this clown show is to be the best clown. And so I decided to do that. And a lot of very lucky things happened. There was a series of events that were very lucky. I think Musk buying Twitter, like a lot of people left. And so that kind of opened up the tech space a little bit for some other people. And then also we had a book that came out right when the Primeagen and Fireship Dev both featured HTMX for just random luck. And so that all kind of came together and I was just being increasingly crazy on Twitter and it ended up working out pretty well as far as getting the word out about HTMX. I do think there's some pretty good theory behind HTMX. Hypermedia is a good technology and HTMX I think is a pretty good implementation of what I would call generalized hypermedia controls. There's some meat there as well, but it's definitely the case that the Twitter account has been very instrumental in getting the word out about it.
I just remember going on Twitter and seeing it at the top of my feed almost all the time. People hating on it, people loving it. It's a very divisive topic.
It is a pretty divisive topic, which I see both sides of it. But you can go to the HTMX store at swag.htmx.org and there's HTMX sucks, like mugs and shirts and stuff like that. So I can see both sides and I think it's right for some stuff and not right for other stuff. And it makes me laugh. Yeah, there was a brief period where whatever I was doing was perfect for the algorithm. And I think that has changed. But for a couple months, everyone was like, why are you at the top of my feed every day? I don't know, man. Just got lucky. So it's good. It got the word out and probably made a couple enemies along the way, but that's all right.
You talked about as you were refactoring intercooler.js into HTMX that you were looking to remove the jQuery dependencies from it. So what do you think it is that modern developers miss about what made jQuery so successful back in the day?
So jQuery, it's a great library. I think far more websites use jQuery than use any other JavaScript library out there. And it originally started off as a patch on top of the bad APIs that were in JavaScript. And then also it standardized the APIs across browsers. That was the other big thing about it. And I think there's still a lot of very good functionality in it, and there's a lot of reasons to use it. People will use HTMX in conjunction with jQuery and use jQuery for like client-side scripting. As far as what modern developers miss about, or like what they don't see about it, I think jQuery was from an era where scripting was more focused on DOM manipulation. What's happened in front-end development in the last decade is that front-end manipulation has become less popular, and instead you have reactive solutions where it's more declarative. And there are good reasons for that, but there's also reasons at times to just get your hands dirty and mess with the DOM directly. And particularly if you use something like HTMX, where the majority of state is synchronized via HTTP requests that return new HTML, then just that lighter touch of just do DOM manipulations, that style of scripting becomes more realistic, better fit probably for an application that's based around hypermedia. So I think a lot of web developers today, they've never done anything but React. And so the old way of hypermedia oriented application, even just a lot of developers today don't know how a form works if you just have a form. Most people understand how a hyperlink would work. Really understanding how the web platform was designed is just something that some people, they just never see it because they're just using React from day one. I don't want to say they're missing. What missing sounds a little judgmental. I would more just say it's a different style and it's a different way of approaching the web, and it has advantages and disadvantages depending on what the rest of your stack looks like and what your application looks like.
Sure. If you've only ever used React or Svelte or Vue, everything looks like it should be solved that way when maybe you just need a couple buttons that interact on your website, or you want a light box to pop up so you can do sliders or something very simple that
Yeah.
jQuery would be great for.
Yeah, React is developing with Shad CN. It's really developing this like infrastructure where you use React not because you like React, because you like the stuff around React. And
Yeah.
jQuery similarly developed. There's a ton of stuff that's based on jQuery, and now it's some of it's showing its age, but it's still there and useful. And I think one of the reasons why it's going to stick around for a very long time is because of that. That's another reason I expect React to stick around for a long time too, is just the knock-on effects of having this sort of community and infrastructure that's built around it that just makes it very convenient. That's one thing people often say when they look at HTMX is, where are all my components? There aren't any. Sorry, you're going to have to go, you can look at Daisy UI or something like that, but it's not HTMX specific, which is intentional. HTMX does one thing. It really generalizes this idea of hypermedia controls, and that's it. And so if you want other stuff like front end, what's the front end scripting solution for HTMX? There isn't one. There's a million. Whatever. If you want to use Alpine, great. If you want to use just jQuery, that's fine. Vanilla JS works. There's a lot of different options. And so that's good in some ways and it's bad in other ways, as with so many other things.
That actually is a good lead into one thing that you mentioned, which was about building the 100-year web service. So explain a little bit more about what that means and how HTMX fits that vision.
Yeah, that's actually a concept that Alex Petros, who's a team member on the HTMX team, came up with. And he did a talk, which I can highly recommend to the listeners. Go find it on YouTube at the Big Sky DevCon. So I'm in Montana and we have a tech conference out here called Big Sky DevCon. And his idea was the simpler you make a system, the longer it will last. And the more you lean into the platform, the longer it will last. And so if you want to have a website that will be usable and deployable in 100 years, then use the simplest stack possible. And you don't want a lot of churn in your stack. And that's one thing, you've probably seen this complaint online. I had to go back and update a React app or a SAP or whatever, and everything changed and all the dependencies are wrong and there's cross dependencies and all these conflicts and so forth. And I haven't had that experience because that's just not the style of development I do, but people complain about it. And so that's an indication of the sort of short-term nature and the very churny nature. And HTMX has gone the other way and said, look, this is, the idea is general. There's, just as an example, there are warts in HTMX that I would fix were I not concerned about backwards compatibility. And I have to accept some level of gronkiness and just bad decisions that I made along the way in order to guarantee that 100-year web service to people. Like, this is something you can deploy and it's going to do the same thing forever. And you're not going to have to update it. You're not going to, if you come in and you update to the next version of HTMX, it's not going to be a complete rewrite. And so it's really a focus on longevity by trying to use the platform as much as possible, have as few dependencies as possible, and keep things as simple as possible.
As a developer who has shot myself in the foot more than once trying to update an old Gatsby blog that I own,
Yeah.
I can very much see the good thinking behind having less dependencies and less
Yeah.
breaking changes like that.
I feel like static site generators are among the worst offenders, which is crazy because they're generating a website. I was like on an early version of 11T and I tried to upgrade it and it was like, nope, my XML parser was wrong. I'm just like, guys, I don't know. So I gave up on it.
Yeah.
So which is crazy again, because it just seems like that's not a problem that should require massive changes, but it's all good. I'm sure there are good technical reasons. So I don't want to be too hard on the people.
So you talked a little bit about this, but stability as a feature is a very core philosophy of HTMX. Are there any other reasons beyond what we've just talked about in the pain of upgrading to a new version of why that is an underrated feature in today's dev world?
I think it's underrated because in development, we focus on like the new thing, right? Like it's a very forward looking industry in general. And I've actually been thinking about this a fair amount lately. The original Game Boy, the guy who designed the original Game Boy, they picked, and I don't know if you remember the original Game Boy, but it was a really crappy screen. It was a 2-bit screen. So you had 4 colors of green. It looked like mashed peas or whatever. But it succeeded versus the other better alternatives that were using color screens and all this like cool stuff. And it succeeded because it had way better battery life and because it was way less complicated. And so they were able to turn out better games for it and blah, blah, blah. There's probably people screaming in the comments that I'm all wrong about the history, but that's the history that I understand. And I think there was this notion of use old stable things instead of new cool things. And there's a psychological aspect of development where we're always a little bit scared. I think every developer has a little bit of fear in them that they are becoming out of date. Like I'm not keeping up with the latest technologies. And that's not an unfounded fear. There are people that have not kept up with technologies and have lost their jobs or not been able to succeed as much as they might like because of it. But that also tends to force our vision away from the past and away from things that are working and maybe a little bit boring. And that leads to this problem with churn and this valorization of upgrade cycles and what's the latest thing and all the rest of it. And often that can be in conflict with what you actually want to achieve. Most of us are not working on something that requires like 3D flying through space, clicking. We're just trying to get a website that does a thing like reservations or keeps track of inventory or something like that. And there's pretty good tools for doing that kind of stuff that have been around for a while and are pretty well polished. And I think if we maybe look at those tools, a good example I give is Ruby on Rails. I think the guy who's in charge of oh shoot, I forget. He's in charge of one of the online selling, like indie sort of selling websites. I forget exactly which one, but he said Rails is tech debt or something like that. And I was like, I don't know, man. Rails is pretty darn polished. Yeah, I can see people saying it's definitely from the previous decade. And like it was the cool thing back in 2010, but it's still a very usable and very, in many ways, very good web app system for building web applications for a lot of classes of web applications. And so I think just pushing back on that a little bit. And also another thing I tell people is look at old technologies. An example I almost always go to immediately because it's really visceral for me is the Visual Basic 6 debugger, which was the best debug. This was in 1999. I used it and it's still the best debugger I've ever used. It's better than anything I use. I'm an IntelliJ or a JetBrains person, so I use Jet stuff. And it's not their fault. The systems just aren't set up to have the debugging experience that I had in Visual Basic 6 back in 1999. I could just edit code, drag the program counter around, do whatever I wanted to, like at runtime. It was crazy. And if you don't know about that idea from history, if you haven't seen that, then you might think, oh, it's always like everything we have is better than what they had back then. And it's not true. There were some really cool ideas. And at some level, HTMX is that idea of let's go back and look at hypermedia and try and improve it for sure because there were problems with it, but let's try and improve it instead of just doing something completely different and completely new and a whole different take on the idea.
You've been around long enough to see that the things that come in vogue go out and then come back and they're just rebranded or there's like a new name for it. Like Signals is just like under JS and things that have been around for a long time. They just
What are you
slapped a new
saying?
label on it.
What are you saying? are you saying exactly?
I'm saying that if you're
Yeah.
talking about debugging in 1999, you have
Yeah.
seen the
I've
ebbs
seen
and
some
flows.
things. I've got the
Yeah, you've seen
1,000-yard
some.
programmer stare for sure. No, it's true. Yeah, and you do get this. There are cycles and there are ideas that get recycled with new names. And I've given up being mad about that. One thing people will sometimes say, oh, HTMX isn't interesting. It's just marketed well. And
Yeah.
but I think there's a good idea there. But also, I've come to appreciate that marketing is an important part of things as well. Like people aren't just going to come to your good idea because it's a good idea. You got to make it happen and go out there and talk on podcasts like this and maybe be silly if that's your personality or write papers or whatever it is. But it's easy to sit back and be like, this is whatever. This is only cool because so and so is pushing it really well. And with the case with HTMX, it's mostly just me by myself. I've obviously got a lot of people I work with now that are involved in the project, but early on it was just me by myself and still went out there and tried to figure out like how can we get this in front of people. And for me that
Yeah.
was like I'm good at being funny, so I'll be funny on Twitter and maybe that'll get some people's attention. So
Yeah. We've passed the field of dreams stage of anything, really. You need to be
yeah.
loud and somehow different to stand out in this crowd.
Yeah, it is. It's bad. Boy, I gave a talk again. The talk I gave at Big Sky DevCon was about open source marketing and what happened and how I felt like HTMX worked. And one of the things I talked about was staying positive, trying to be really like relentlessly positive, which is not my natural personality, but I've learned it's a better way to go through life as I've gotten older. And there is this, it's unfortunate, but the way the internet works, like it really wants drama. And I talk about that in that talk. Here's how you can create drama without really hurting people and it's things like that. So there's a lot of downsides, obviously. There's a lot of downsides to the way social media works today. But I have to say it's been very effective for HTMX.
If it works, it works.
Yeah.
All right, so let's pivot back a little bit towards HTMX in particular. So one of the things that you talked about are API consistency over time. So what are some
Mhm.
of the steps that you're taking to ensure that stays as a prime driver for HTMX?
Yeah, I think the first thing you have to do is get the concept right. I think the thing about HTMX, and if you look back at Intercooler, the API difference between the two isn't that large. And I think what happened there is by dumb luck, got the core API right. Use attributes, issue a request based on an event, and insert the resulting HTML content somewhere in the DOM using CSS selectors. So in a lot of those, I kind of leaned on existing stuff like, oh, use CSS selectors rather than inventing my own thing or whatever. And so I think getting that core concept right up front has been really important for HTMX, and having a decade of Intercooler before that to validate the idea made it easier. And then once you're past that, the way that we've done it for the most part is when we've got these situations like warts that exist, we lean heavily on configuration. And so someone's like, I don't like how this works. I don't like the default swapping mechanism for HTMX, for example. Okay, there's a config and you can change it so it does what you think is the right default swapping behavior. And when we make a change, so when we went from 1.0 to 2.0, we made some changes to the underlying behavior. And so people did have like small compared to a major version release for most JavaScript libraries, but still an upgrade. But we also gave them, if you want to just go back to the old behavior, here's the config that will restore that old behavior. So we didn't remove the behavior, we just configured it out. And
Yeah.
that makes your code a little uglier because now you've got an if statement somewhere and there's just more to look at, and the code kind of gets a little gronkier every time that happens. So you try to minimize that, but still using that mindset that we're not breaking backwards compatibility because I think we've got the right API here. Using that mindset really makes the API to your code much more stable. Another example of that mindset is HTMX really changed the API when compared with, or it was a significant change from Intercooler. And so we created a new project like HTMX instead of just Intercooler 2.0 or 3.0 or whatever it would have been.
Yeah.
We said, no, we're just going to do a new project. And similarly, I was kind of looking at HTMX and I'm like, man, this is a lot of code and kind of crazy. What if we did like a minimal version of HTMX? And instead of having HTMX3 be this like minimal version of HTMX, instead I created another project called Fixie, which is the ideas of HTMX boiled down to the absolute minimum. And so that project project. HTMX itself, it's got a bunch of comments in it and JDoc and stuff like that in it, but it's 3,000 or I think maybe even 5,000 lines of code. It's a big piece of JavaScript, whereas Fixie is 80 lines of code or 89 lines of code. It doesn't do everything HTMX does, like intentionally. It was like, we're going to do a minimalist version of this instead. So it doesn't have history support and all the cool stuff that HTMX has in it. But it's a really teeny project, but I did it as a separate project and a separate idea. And so that, I think, is the sort of thinking that can lead to these stable long-term APIs, particularly for foundational things. If you're going to build a website on something, it really stinks if you have to redo it every year or so. And I think we've gotten used to it a little bit in the front end world, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, I know developers who like that is their thing. It's, oh, the hot new framework came out. I must rewrite my entire website in it over the weekend and see how it works,
Yeah,
even though nothing visually has changed about it, but it's
right.
rewritten in the latest and greatest.
Yeah, now like 10% of the website doesn't work quite right.
Yeah.
Okay. But again, I understand where that desire for the new and that fear of the old and becoming irrelevant comes from, because it's
Mhm.
not an unfounded fear in our industry.
So, how do you balance the innovation of adding new features to the core without going crazy and just putting everything in there that anybody has ever suggested would be cool?
Yeah. Are you familiar with grugbrain.dev? Have you ever read that
I'm
website? Okay.
not.
That's a website that I wrote. You can read that. And one of the things I talk about in that website is saying no. And so you have to, over time, and I'm going to be perfectly frank, I think in HTMX, I haven't said no enough. I think it has too many features in it. But then once you put a feature in, you can't take it out from a backwards compatibility standpoint. And so we've
Mhm.
really, I think HTMX is better than most projects, but it's not as good as I would like it to have been with respect to saying no to things. And Fixie, on the other hand, the sort of minimalist thing that I've been working on, I'm just going to say no to everything. I've said no to myself. I'm using it in some projects that I'm working on, and I'm like, this would be nice to have. Nope, not going to do it. I think that's a big part of that story, is like saying, being willing to say no to new and cool features. And HTMX and Fixie both, and Intercooler to a lesser extent, have extension mechanisms where you can add extensions to them, and that takes a lot of pressure off the core. So if someone comes in and says, I got this cool idea, it's cool, do it as an extension, and then let's see, can it live as an extension, or does it need to move into the core? And we've had a few things that have worked that way. One, just as an example, in HTMX 1.0, there was a WebSocket and a server-side event support like in the library itself. And in HTMX 2, we removed those and made those plugins. And we had already had plugins, and they were deprecated for the internal version was deprecated and undocumented for a long time. So it didn't break very much existing HTMX code. But that was an
Mhm.
example of stuff we actually took out of the core and made extensions. So I think having an extensions mechanism, and when you're talking about front end, extensions also imply, or often best implemented as event driven things, like emitting a lot of it and allowing configurability via events is a big part of making
Mhm.
these things all hang together in a way that's loosely coupled, so you don't have tight coupling between things. So that's like the technical thing. I also think the fact that HTMX again had this like core idea of generalizing hypermedia controls makes it easier to not bring in other stuff, because you can always look at the idea and say, is this really about improving that or not? And
Mhm.
often for HTMX anyways, the answer is often not, and it just doesn't belong in core. And the downside to all of that, great, this thing's stable, is that it's hard to get attention, because the new release of whatever is like cool and does all this crazy through whatever, and whereas HTMX is just this boring library. And so my conclusion there is, okay, I will be outrageous on Twitter to get attention so that I can keep the library itself relatively stable. And
Yeah.
so that's one of the trade-offs that I make. And it's not a big trade-off, like for me, I enjoy being silly, but that's my outlook, I would say, on that.
So, for people who haven't actually tried HTMX versus the Reacts or the Views or the Angular, how would you position it for them to think about it if they wanted to try it?
Yeah, I think it's a different way of doing things. I don't think you should try to take HTMX and fit it in to the React way of doing things. It's a hypermedia oriented library. And I would tell people, first of all, don't use HTMX just because you just heard about it and people say it's cool. Don't do that. That's not a good idea. If you're interested in HTMX, one thing I like to recommend is maybe try it out for an internal tool. Do you have an internal tool at your company that is neglected and doesn't have a very good UI associated with it? And that might be a good proving ground to see what HTMX is capable of for you. We have a book, hypermedia.systems, that it's available free online, but you can also buy it. In there, the first 3 chapters, we go through and build a traditional web app, just an old school links and forms, no JavaScript at all, web application. And it's in Python, so most people can understand it, and just show how the old system worked. And you have a better experience if you come from that world to HTMX rather than trying to say, here's how I would have done everything in React and what's the HTMX equivalent, because there isn't really one. It's just a really different way of doing things. I tell people, I tell people this online all the time. If you have an existing React app that is working, don't use HTMX. There's not, if it's falling apart and you know how traditional web apps worked and the hypermedia model appeals to you, okay, maybe. And we have a success story up on the essays page on the HTMX website about someone that had that situation. Like they had a React app and their front end developer wasn't being productive and they couldn't get things done. And then they finally just said, look, we're going to do this in HTMX instead. And they had a good outcome with it. But if you're not in that situation where things look pretty dicey, then I think HTMX is a bad idea. That's what I would say. Internal tools, I think, are the best place to start. And then also taking some time to understand like the original web work, and maybe the Hypermedia Systems book would help with that.
You've had a noticeable impact on the popularity of template fragments, and you've talked a lot about that
Yeah.
as hypermedia text. What are other areas of the ecosystem that you hope to influence next? Are there any other things that you have your sights set on?
I think the template fragments, this is server side template fragments. So the idea, just to give the listeners an idea, is when you're using HTMX, it's very common to use server side templates, which for a lot of people is an older idea, like it's an older concept, but it's just a way to produce HTML that has some programmatic logic in it for iterating and producing a bunch of rows in a table or whatever. And one of the things about HTMX, one of the things it does is it makes it so that any element can issue a request and then replace any part of the screen. That's like the core idea of HTMX. And it turns out that it's really nice if you're using server-side templates to be able to mark a section as like, hey, this is a sub chunk. You could always do this via what are called includes, where you pull it out to another template and then you include it in a template. But the problem with that is that you lose what is called locality, which means you can't look at the original template and see everything. Like, where is everything? And you have to navigate back and forth between these two files to understand what's going on. And with template fragments, what you can do is mark a section and say, I want to be able to render just this chunk. And that turns out to play really well with HTMX, because HTMX does a lot of, I just want to update this little chunk. So mark it as a template fragment and grab it and update it. And so I pushed that idea pretty hard for a while, and a lot of template libraries now support that, which is, I think, a really good thing. As far as like other server side things that I would encourage or try to develop, I'm going to go back to Ruby on Rails. I think Ruby on Rails has a lot of really cool ideas that are just sitting there waiting for these other server side frameworks that aren't as focused on server side rendering to just pick off. There's some really neat ideas sitting around there. One thing that I really like from Ruby on Rails, and a lot of people again will be screaming in the comments about it, is I like their object relational mapping system, Active Record. I think it has a lot of very good functionality. It has a nice event system, and it just has a lot of infrastructure that's super useful. And I think in general, I hope that people look back at some of these older, and when I say older, I only mean 10 years older, not as old as me. So only 10 years ago, some of these systems, Django's another one that has like a lot of really cool ideas in it, and I think could be profitably incorporated into some of the newer web systems. So no big concept jumps out at me, but lots of little like cool things.
Yeah. Are there any open source tools or projects in the HTMX ecosystem that you're excited about?
My fixie's cool. It's not changing at all. So yeah, if you minimalism, and that's designed to, boy, that takes all my ideas kind of like to the extreme. That's cool. There's a lot of interesting around HTMX technologies. I've got to get the list up in front of me, but what do I want to, Facet is a cool thing that you can go on so if you go to htmx.org/discord, that'll bounce you to our Discord server. And there's a related text section that has like a few different related ideas. There's a library called Surreal JS, integrates well with HTMX, and that it allows you to embed scripting, but just JavaScript like normal scripting in a web page, which is one of the things that HTMX encourages is putting the behavioral aspects of an element on the element itself rather than separating them apart from one another. And so that's an interesting thing. Another interesting concept that someone came in, the author of this library came into HTMX and was like, hey, he wanted to redo a bunch of stuff. And I'm pretty old school and was like, nah, we're not doing all that. And then he had the correct response to that, which was like, I'll go do my own library. And it's, yes, perfect. And he created a library called DataStar. And so DataStar is this server sent event oriented take on the hypermedia world. It also has non hypermedia signals based data as well. That's a cool project to look at. So a lot of cool things happening around it. Another project I often mention, which it's really more of a competitor to HTMX than anything, is Unpoly, which is an older and very mature JavaScript framework that is also hypermedia oriented like HTMX and has a fair number of features that HTMX doesn't have. It's a much better solution if you want progressive enhancement than HTMX. If you use HTMX and you want progressive enhancement, which means you want your website to work without JavaScript, then you have to do work. You have to use HTMX in a certain way. And Unpoly is designed to always support that. It's just focused on that idea. I really like Unpoly. I like the author a whole bunch. He's not crazy like me, so he doesn't get as much attention, but he's a really solid guy.
You talk about the long-term dream of pushing the HTMX style behavior into the HTML standard through the Triptych project. Can you tell us a little bit more about that initiative?
First of all, I've built my identity around mispronouncing it triptych. So someone was like, no, you're pronouncing it the right way, but I've been pronouncing it the wrong way for my entire life. That is a project. Alex Petros was the spearhead for that project. And the idea was to take, like, what's the minimum viable, useful functionality in HTMX that we could realistically get into the HTML specification. And the three things that he came up with were adding the non-get and post methods to forms. So you can also issue puts and patches, which is crazy that you can't do that. But so do that. That's one. Allow buttons to issue their own requests. So just let buttons be a hypermedia control without having to be embedded in a form. So that's two. And then number three is allowing the response, the HTML response from a request to be placed anywhere in the DOM. So basically being able to target, like even to say, okay, button, when you get your content back, put it in this div instead. And that last one is called transclusion. And it actually exists, believe it or not, in HTML. But like today, if you have an anchor tag, you can put a target attribute on that anchor tag and then put an ID in it. And here's the bad part. That ID has to be for an iframe. But if you click on that link, it'll get that content, but it'll put the response in the iframe. And so most people at this point aren't big iframe. Iframes aren't a thing anymore. And it is there in nascent form, and this idea of transclusion. And so that's going to be the hardest one to get in, but it really addresses this problem that you had with the old web, which is anytime you submitted a form or clicked on a link, there was this big ka-chunk where you had a big request and the whole page came back and you lost your scroll state and all the rest. And just like flash of unstyled content and all that stuff goes away if you have this sort of general functionality. So we're working on that. We've got some context on the Chrome team, and we're trying to write some academic papers around that stuff and get people interested in it. But that's definitely a long haul. The HTML spec is massive and very difficult to get changed, but I'm optimistic. I think you always overestimate what you can accomplish in a year and underestimate what you can accomplish in a decade. And that's been my experience. So I'm hopeful.
So, in the next 10 to 15 years, what do you think web development looks like, and where does HTMX fall into that area?
I hope hypermedia becomes a thing. People become interested in it. It's not a silver bullet because there is no silver bullet for development, but I hope we do get web developers in general interested in hypermedia and the ideas of hypermedia. Again, they're cool ideas in and of themselves. And so I hope people move that direction when it's appropriate. And I try to outline when I feel like hypermedia and HTMX might be a good approach and when it's not in some essays on the HTMX website. I think we're probably in a point where there needs to be a retrenchment. Like we had this explosion of here's all these different ideas, and we probably need to like say, okay, let's like pick through the wreckage and figure out what the good ones are and maybe incorporate them more into the standards of the web. I know that signals is a big thing, which is not hypermedia, but it's a different way of building applications in general. And so I know there are some ideas around standardizing that. So I think we're probably going to have a little bit of retrenchment and okay, we've tried all this crazy stuff, like what worked. And I hope hypermedia is one of those things.
I think there'll always be a place for it myself.
Yeah, it's a
It
good
is.
idea. It's an old
Okay,
idea
let's move
too,
in.
like 1960s or even like 1940s, if you consider Vannevar Bush or whatever his name is, the originator of it. So it's been around for a while.
All right, let's move into the quick round before we wrap things up. So, one word that you would use to describe HTMX.
Hypermedia.
And what is a web dev trend that you would like to see disappear?
Dunking on people for their technical choices.
That's a good one. What is one thing that you think jQuery got absolutely right?
Backwards compatibility.
Yeah, it's true. I remember seeing just recently that there was a survey done of the web, and 75% of websites that were running JavaScript were running jQuery in some form
Yeah.
or fashion.
Yep. Good old
Amazing.
jQuery.
Carson, it has been great having you on the show today. If people want to find out more about HTMX or find out more about you, where's the best place to find you online?
HTMX.org is the website for HTMX, and the Twitter account. I'm actually not on Twitter right now. I gave it up for Lent, which was a good thing for me. But the Twitter account it's not X, twitter.com/HTMX.org. And Alex has been posting occasionally to it. And then Hypermedia Systems is the website for our book, which I think, particularly for your listeners who don't understand how the web like originally worked and was, I don't want to say it's how it was designed to work. That's not, again, not to say that you can't use other approaches to things, but the way the web was designed, I would really profit from reading in particular the first 3 or 4 chapters of that book. So
Fantastic. Thanks again for joining us on LogRocket. It's been great having you.
yeah, thank you, Paige.